Picture this. It's a single summer day back in 1709, and on this one day, the entire map of European power gets completely redrawn. We are talking about the Battle of Poltava, a massive clash that would basically end one powerful empire and announce to the entire world that a new one had arrived. So let's dive in and see how this one battle really did change everything. And you can see it in this painting, right? This wasn't just some run-of-the-mill battle. No, this was the grand finale for the Swedish Empire's time at the top, and at the exact same time, it was the explosive debut of the Russian Empire on the world stage. And look, there's absolutely no way to sugarcoat this. For Sweden, Poltava was a complete and utter disaster. This was the moment their incredible war machine, a machine that had dominated Northern Europe for a century, was just broken. So the big question is, how on earth did this happen? Let's break it down. So why do we keep saying this one battle was so important? Well, to really get it, you have to understand that this was the critical turning point of a huge, sprawling conflict, the Great Northern War. Before Poltava, Sweden was, without a doubt, the heavyweight champion of the North. After Poltava, everything changed. I mean, the scales of power just tipped dramatically and pretty much overnight. The Swedish Empire, this titan of the North, saw its era of dominance just come to a screeching halt. And stepping right into that vacuum was the Russian Tsardom, led by the super-ambitious Peter the Great. It emerged as the new major force in Eastern Europe. This single day really did set the stage for the next few centuries of European history. Okay, so let's rewind a little bit, because to really understand the fall, you got to appreciate the height they fell from. Before their fateful invasion of Russia, the Swedish Empire and its army, well, they seemed totally unstoppable, a true military juggernaut of the age. At the head of it all was their warrior king, Charles XII, an absolute military genius. His army, the Karelians, were famous, even feared, for their aggressive tactics. They'd close in fast, fire one devastating volley at point-blank range, and then charge with bayonets. They knocked Denmark-Norway out of the war right at the start. Then they scored this legendary victory at Narva, completely smashing a Russian army that was way, way bigger than theirs. After that, they spent 6 years just beating down the huge Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. By 1707, only Russia was left standing. And Charles, full of confidence, decided it was time to go for the knockout blow. So, in 1707, Charles launches his invasion of Russia. He's expecting another quick, glorious victory. But what he got instead was the beginning of the end, thanks to two of Russia's most powerful allies, scorched-earth tactics and the weather. The whole thing started off strong with a massive army of almost 44,000 soldiers. But things started to go wrong almost immediately. The Russians just wouldn't give them a big fight. Instead, they retreated, burning everything behind them. This forced the Swedes to march south, away from their supplies. Then came a huge blow. A critical supply column was ambushed and totally wiped out. And then nature itself just seemed to turn on them. The winter of 1708 was called the Great Frost. It was the most brutal winter Europe had seen in 500 years. And the result? It was catastrophic. By the time the snow melted in 1709, the once unstoppable Swedish army had been cut in half. We're talking frostbite, starvation, disease. They were down to just 20,000 men. A staggering, almost unbelievable loss of soldiers before the main battle had even started. So with his army now weakened and desperately low on supplies, Charles laid siege to the fortress of Poltava, over in modern-day Ukraine. And this was exactly the move that finally baited Tsar Peter. He marches his massive, well-fed, well-supplied army out to meet the Swedes for one final, decisive showdown. And just look at these numbers. The odds were just overwhelmingly against the Swedes. They were outnumbered on the field almost 3-1. But the really insane difference was the firepower. The Swedes had only managed to drag 4 cannons to the fight. The Russians? They had 86. So the Swedes weren't just outnumbered, they were massively, hopelessly outgunned. And, as if things weren't bad enough, disaster strikes their leadership. Just a few days before the battle, King Charles, the tactical genius, the guy who personally led from the front in every charge, gets hit by a stray bullet in the foot. The wound was so bad he couldn't even stand up. He had to hand over command to his generals at the very last minute. It was just the worst possible luck at the worst possible time. The Russians, on the other hand, had prepared the battlefield perfectly. Peter the Great had spent years modernizing his army, and he put that new discipline to good use. His engineers built this whole system of small forts called redoubts right in the path of the Swedish army. The idea was brilliant in its simplicity. It would break up that famous, terrifying Swedish charge, slow them down, and funnel them into killing zones before they even got close to the main Russian line. So, how did it all go so wrong for the Swedes on the day? Well, it was really a cascade of failures. First, their plan for a surprise dawn attack fell apart when their troops got lost in the dark and couldn't coordinate. Then, their attack on those redoubts just completely stalled out, which caused a ton of confusion. In that chaos, a full third of their infantry got cut off from the main force and had no choice but to surrender. So by the time the main armies finally clashed, the weakened, outnumbered Swedes were just swallowed up and crushed by the sheer weight of the Russian numbers. The defeat wasn't just a defeat. It was total. And the consequences were immediate, and they were profound. Right there, on the fields of Poltava, the old order of Europe died, and a new one was born right in its place. To put it bluntly, the Swedish army just ceased to exist. It wasn't a retreat, it was an annihilation. King Charles himself barely managed to escape, but the rest of his once invincible army was cornered and forced to surrender just a few days later. And you can really see the whole story in the fates of these two leaders. On one side, you have a wounded King Charles, forced to flee for his life. And on the other, you have a triumphant Tsar Peter, finally seeing his grand ambitions realized as his new empire is born in victory. The fortunes of two entire nations decided right there. The fallout across Europe was immediate and, honestly, irreversible. The Swedish Empire's time as a major player was over, for good. Russia was now the undisputed top dog in Eastern Europe. King Charles had to spend the next 5 years in exile, and as soon as Sweden's old enemies saw how weak it was, they all jumped back into the war to pick apart the pieces of a crumbling empire. Which leaves us with a really fascinating question to think about. What if that incredibly cold winter, that great frost, had never happened? If it hadn't crippled the Swedish army before they even got to Poltava, could the brilliant Charles XII have pulled off another miracle victory? It really makes you think about how much of history can turn on a single battle, or even just a change in the weather.